welcome to the public newsroom. We're so excited that you could be here today. My name is Ellie. Like I mentioned, I run the public newsroom series. It's a monthly digital workshop where we discuss important local issues and highlight grassroots efforts to meet information needs. Today's session is also a collaboration with the Chicago Public Library. This workshop is part of their series, One Book, One Chicago, which this year was inspired by the novel Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. The Public Newsroom is a program by City Bureau. City Bureau is a nonprofit media organization serving the South and West Sides, for those of you who don't know us. And today we are really excited to be joined by Sarah Ritchie, who is the Director of Communications at Kino Border Initiative. Kino Border Initiative is an organization that aims to promote immigration policies that affirm the dignity of the human person. They're based in Nogales on both sides of the border, so Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora. Also joining us are members of one of City Bureau's reporting teams. They've been reporting on civic participation within immigrant communities in Chicago. That team includes Alex Arriaga, who is the co-planner of this event, as well as Linda Lopez, Paco Alvarez, and Lilichi. And lastly, I just want to shout out Antonio Gutierrez of Organized Communities Against Deportations, also known as OCAD. They were meant to present today, but couldn't make it due to circumstances outside of their control. I still encourage you to look into that organization that is doing really great work in the Chicagoland area. You can find them at organizedcommunities.org. That link is also in the agenda. So today we're going to examine how COVID-19 and the Trump administration have shaped immigration policy and enforcement in the recent past. We'll also learn how immigrant advocates like Kino Border Initiative are organizing in response and how their tactics may shift as we transition administrations. We're going to start off with a presentation from Sarah and then transition into a journaling and discussion activity that will be facilitated by members of our reporting team. Before we get into that, does anyone have any questions about the logistics? I see something on the chat about not being able to sign in. I can troubleshoot that with you in a sec, but any questions about run of show today? Cool. Well, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and shift it over to Sarah so that she can introduce herself a little bit more as well as the organization. Yeah, so Sarah, take it away.
Great, thanks, Ellie. Hey everyone, my name, as mentioned, is Sarah Ritchie, and I do work in communications for the Kino Border Initiative. And I have a lot of topics that I would love to cover, but I'm specifically going to just pick one for today, which is specifically looking at how Trump and COVID, which are still pretty big topics, have affected the dynamic and the context along the border, which is where we are. So I have a presentation for us just to keep myself organized and also on track, and then hopefully can share some good information with you all in that way. So give me just a second just to get sharing my screen here. Hold on just a sec. You would think with all this these Zoom meetings, I'd be faster at this, but I'll get it here. Alrighty, everyone can see my screen at this point, I assume. Great, so again, the topic at hand today is Trump and COVID. Again, big topics, but specifically the subtopics are looking at some of the policies that we've seen first with Trump, so policies that predate COVID, and then looking at the final policy that has exacerbated the situation that we've been seeing, and that has been with border closures. So just to give you all a heads up of kind of what is coming your way during the presentation. So we'll focus in on metering and what that is. We'll focus in on MPP and then border closures, and then close with looking at how we as a community and how migrants are organizing around these issues and how they plan to do so moving forward now that we'll be welcoming in a new administration. So first, just to kind of zoom out a little bit for a second, just to see where we are. As mentioned, we are on both sides of the border. So there used to be one Nogales. There's now two because the border crossed Nogales. So we are in both. So we're in Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora. This is just to kind of give you an aerial view of where we are. So this is the Sonoran Desert. We are, if you can see my mouse where it's hovering, this is the building that we...
Hey, Sarah, sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
I think we are looking at a screen of your Finder window, not the presentation.
Oh, let me try opening it again. Can you see it now?
No, it just looks like the icon got clicked on. I think maybe if you want to stop sharing and reshare.
Yeah, let's see. Did that work?
Yes, that looks great.
Oh,
Awesome,
great.
thank you.
This is all that you missed. So going into, and so you didn't see this yet either.
No, but we can now.
Okay, so this is Nogales, Sonora, and Arizona. Here is where we just left off. So if you can now see where my mouse is hovering, this is the building that we're in currently. Just to put it into perspective to see how much Kino has grown, which is both a blessing and also disheartening that Kino has to be such a big organization. This is the little building that we started in 2009. And so just this year we've moved over and we've been able to offer lots more services, which that is the part that is absolutely the benefit, the blessing of being somewhere where we can carry out our services even better. And you'll see right down the road from us here is the Mariposa border entry. There are two in Nogales. So we're in the more rural area. And then coming right down the road, that's where the Kino Border Initiative is. Just to clarify, when we're talking about any of the services that we offer directly to migrants, those are absolutely always going to be on the Sonora side. Sometimes that's an overlooked detail, but one that's important to remember because the migrants that we are serving are not able to be into the US, and that's why our services are in Sonora, but we do have presence in the US as well. So just to highlight what our services even are and what Kino Border Initiative does, we are a bi-national organization. That's a huge part of our identity, again, in both Nogales. And we provide humanitarian aid, first and foremost, to migrants on the Sonora side of the border, but we also engage in education and advocacy on both sides of the border with a vision of promoting more workable, just, and humane migration between the US and Mexico. And so just to break down those three pillars, the humanitarian aid that we're providing, again, all of that happening right here in this building, is providing food, first and foremost, vitamins, medications, filling prescriptions, first aid, for example, because sometimes people will be deported to us and they had just been walking through the desert. So tending to really basic necessities such as healing one's blisters, giving them a hot meal, letting them shower, whatever it may be. And then depending on the demographics that we are serving, that's what totally directs our education and advocacy. So educating different groups, different churches, universities, whatever entity it may be about what it is that we are seeing firsthand on the ground, and then also using that education tool as kind of a bridge to our advocacy efforts, but also working directly with congressional offices and other larger advocacy organizations as well, so that we can be that on the grounds presence for them, and that those people and those organizations can kind of be our megaphones in policy change and in advocacy efforts. Talking a little bit about the demographic that we serve and have served and how that's changed a little bit. I think this is a really telling photo to show kind of the idea or the vision in which Kino Border Initiative was founded, and that was to respond to massive deportations. So when looking back at when the Kino Border Initiative was founded, it was right in the first year of Obama's presidency, and he went on to be the deporter in chief. So we saw massive deportations during his 8 years, and our focus was very much working with deportees. And this is that original building that I showed you from an aerial view that was very small, and you can see it was painted right on the wall there. Like, we are a center for deported migrants, because at that point it was a little difficult to envision perhaps one day working with a demographic that wasn't the deported demographic. And so that is the way in which our work has changed exponentially with the Trump administration, who has really taken it upon himself to dismantle the asylum system. And so the demographic that we find showing up at our doors are not deportees. The majority anymore is not deportees. Rather, they are asylum seekers and those who have been subjected to those two policies that I mentioned at the beginning, metering and MPP. But before I can explain why metering and MPP is such a huge shift, I'm going to first explain how the system worked before. I have two slides here that just, to me, felt really noteworthy to capture. They're both from Mother Jones, if anyone reads that, and they are in themselves titles that really encapsulate what we've seen under the Trump administration. These both were articles that came out just last month. One I actually included in the reading material section if you all want to take a look at it. This one I did not, but you can see the title here. America's immigration system was already broken. Trump made a weapon out of its shards. And so in those shards, seeing President Trump and also Stephen Miller, who has really been his right-hand man or advisor in utilizing the political machine to carry out some of these really inhumane policies that we have been seeing on the border. And as a result, we've seen asylum totally be dismantled to the point where one could say, at this point, asylum is dead. And it's going to take a lot of work to revive that. And so that's, hopefully there will be a more hopeful message at the end of the presentation, because we were so worried to see the possibility of 4 more years of the dismantling of asylum. So now we can at least get to work on the reparation, but we'll get to that part. So looking at what asylum looked like at the border before Trump, I just realized they're all numbered 1. They go in order. So number 1 is a migrant would present themselves at the port of entry. Now, for people that already know this, I'm sorry if this is a repeat, but it's really important to kind of understand some of these steps to understand why metering and MPP are such game changers. So a migrant would present themselves at the port of entry or perhaps in the desert. So not looking at the way in which someone would claim asylum once they're already in the United States for a while. And upon expressing fear, or rather by law, they're supposed to be asked if they are fleeing harm. The CBP agent, or the Customs and Border Protection agent, so that would be Border Patrol, for example, or the CBP agent at the port of entry. By law, they would then take that asylum seeker to a USCIS officer, so the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services officer. They are the ones that are trained to carry out the credible fear interviews and conduct them with the entire family unit. Maybe not in the same room, but no one gets separated during that time when claiming asylum. And if they pass that credible fear interview, then they go into the United States. They're detained for, I put undetermined amount of time because it really depends on the situation and if minors are involved or not and how background checks come out. And then they are released to a sponsor, either a sponsor that they have chosen because they know someone that lives there, that's typically the case, or a sponsor that is assigned to them. And then they wait for their asylum proceedings while they are either in detention or with their sponsor, and eventually their work permit comes in and they're able to work as they as they go through those proceedings. For those who like a visual, I find the visual a little confusing, but for some people that works a little bit better. It's really just re-explaining everything that I was just, it lays out everything that I was explaining. So that's the non-citizen arrives, they get apprehended by CBP, they're then passed along, and if they have fear, then they have to be taken to the USCIS officer. They'll go through that interview. If they pass, then they go into the United States. And these are the two steps that we won't even get to, whether they win asylum or not. The point is access to due process and even getting a shot at having those asylum proceedings and having their case heard in front of a judge. And that is what has been completely choked off through MPP and metering. So I'll pause there and just ask Ellie if there's any questions so far. I didn't tell people to write anything into the chat box, but perhaps I should give that invitation now. I'm gonna kind of be pausing at different parts to see if there are any questions, but maybe no one wrote anything yet. Is there anything yet?
No questions so far, but if anyone does have questions now that they'd like to say out loud, feel free to unmute yourself and do so.
Okay, thank you. So first off, we saw metering, and it did get implemented in a kind of a rollout staggered way. It didn't hit all of the ports of entry at the same time, but metering is the idea of creating a waiting room in Mexico at the border for claiming asylum. So metering or metering lists are waiting lists for asylum, or a waiting room, we call them both. And they're the names of asylum seekers in a handwritten notebook at the port of entry. At different ports of entry, they have been managed by different groups. Either some non-governmental organizations have taken the list, a Mexican identity related to immigration, or just part of the municipality, or officials at the port of entry. Every port of entry has just kind of decided to do what they want. And for some ports of entry, Nogales, for example, it started with Mexican officials managing the list. And then what we found was people would get on the list and then they'd drop off, and then Mexican officials would sell that spot to someone else seeking asylum so that people could butt. And seeing that corruption, then a group of NGOs in Nogales then took on that list. But with so much transition, it was just very unclear how this handwritten list was supposed to be operating, with no direction from the US as to how it was supposed to work. The US just said, we will let you all know when we're letting people in, when we're not, we'll make up our minds as we go, but you keep a list, and when we tell you, okay, 20 people can come in, then you all tell us who those 20 people are. So not managed by the US at all. And because the US never said how many people they would let in each day, there was never a quota that was announced, there was no sort of way of gauging the wait time. In Nogales, it ended up, before COVID hit, ended up being about 3 to 4 months that people would be waiting. Again, that being a little different if you could pay your way to the top of the list and if that actually worked or not. And so I think this paints a picture. I mean, I feel like stressed even describing it, as to how unorganized it was and how it was really hard for us to give any sort of direction or clarity to migrants who thought they were showing up at a port of entry, that they would be able to claim asylum in the moment, or at least kickstart that process. So instead, we found these waiting lists to really be the first game changer that we saw along the border. Are there any questions about metering lists before I jump to MPP? Because it's kind of a series of things here. Okay, you might think of some along the way, but I'll go ahead and jump into MPP. But first, actually, I forgot I had this one. This is just to give you some insight as to how backlogged, how quickly it became so backlogged. Now, Tijuana is the city that has the most, or has the longest wait list or metering list, But just to show you, when they first implemented it in July, 500 people were processed for asylum, but that list grew to nearly 10,000 just within a month. And so that list has grown and grown and grown. And so this is only creating more problems for, a system that's already backlogged, in which the Trump administration has not invested in US CIS workers to kind of like keep this going at a rate that it should be going. Looking at MPP, so MPP does stand for Migrant Protection Protocols. It's also known as the Remain in Mexico policy or program, which is probably a more fitting title than protection protocols. And this is an agreement between the United States and Mexico that at the time when someone, an asylum seeker, is given their court date, they will not wait for it in the US. Rather, they will be returned to Mexico, and they will wait for it in Mexico and be expected to show up at the port of entry where their court date is supposed to be on the day of their court date. So we see metering list for subject people to maybe 3-4 months, at least in Nogales, could look different elsewhere. And then after they're waiting those 3 or 4 months, okay, they get to the top of the wait list, they're called in, they show up at the port of entry, and it has to be the one where you put your name on the wait list, because they're not managing like a universal wait list. It's specifically for that port of entry. So someone would then go to the port of entry after their number is called. They would then pass their credible fear interview in theory, and then they'd say, okay, we're going to give you a court date. Your court date is for whatever date it may be. And we were finding that they were normally court dates about 4 or 5 months out. So then asylum seekers finding out, okay, for 4 or 5 more months in the same town I was just, okay. And then they're returned to Mexico. So it was just creating these really, really long waits. And in a place that statistically is not one that we consider safe, and not one that a lot of asylum seekers consider safe, especially because the majority of asylum seekers we work with are from Mexico, and they don't feel like they can get out of that network of persecution if they're still in their country. And so this has been really anxiety producing, to say the least, for a lot of the asylum seekers that we work with, that thought of being in Mexico for months and months and months longer. And so these waits just became even longer once we saw COVID hit. This is something just also to kind of give a little bit of perspective as to where MPP courts even are. The border is long and there's not very many. And so people apprehended in Arizona, for example, can be returned to Nogales. And so we have asylum seekers with MPP that come to Kino Border Initiative, but they're expected to go 14 hours away to show up to their court date in El Paso, because there is no option for them near or close to Tucson or Phoenix, or the Tucson-Phoenix corridor. And so if we remember back to where the arrow pointing to Nogales was earlier, it's right about here. And so with the onset of COVID, they were then postponing court dates, but not letting people know. And they went and made that 14-hour trip over to El Paso just to find out they didn't have a court date. So jumping a little bit into, okay, the pandemic hits, we've already seen metering, we've already seen MPP. What does that mean now during the pandemic? And what could it possibly mean after the pandemic, whenever that may be, or what it could mean for when Biden is in office? Are there any questions that have come in, just because I can't see the chat box, Ellie?
Yeah, we have 2 questions. The first is just, when did we first start seeing these meter-in lists?
Right, so the metering list so they were different in different cities. In Nogales, it was in 2019, so January of 2019, we started seeing the lists. And then we started seeing MPP with people being returned to Nogales in January of 2020, so just this year. So, but it was different for each port of entry, since they did kind of a rollout. Mm-hmm.
Got it. And the second question is, what have been your thoughts on media coverage on migrants and asylum seekers under Trump? How is the media part of this story?
That's a great question. In general, we feel like in the immigration conversation, because migrants have literally been pushed out of sight, out of mind, that has been a little bit of what we've seen in the media. However, it's not 100% absent in the media. I would say more recently with MPP specifically, that the media has focused more on that policy rather than focusing on metering. Metering was kind of the overlooked policy, and then MPP started to get a lot more attention. I would say more in the last like 4 months. I'm not really quite sure why that was, but at least that's how we felt. Because when it first began, I don't think a lot of people knew it was happening necessarily. So I think it took a couple months, at least in Nogales, thinking, okay, it started in January. It took a couple months for people to start paying attention to this. Mm-hmm. So thinking, okay, the pandemic hit in March, technically, and so borders have been closed since March 20th. And so what was ruled or decided on March 20th was that the borders were going to be closed to non-essential traffic, and asylum was deemed non-essential. And so at the time the pandemic hit, there were a little over 60,000 migrants who were in Mexico under MPP. That number now is a little over 70,000, which is confusing to us because we're told that no one's processing for asylum. However, 10,000 people have been processed for asylum in the sense that they've been given court dates and have been sent back to Mexico under MPP. And so there is a lot of discrepancy along the southern border as to if a border agent will decide to take them to an asylum seeker to a USCIS officer, and if they will decide to just let them pass their credible fear interview. And so it's been really frustrating and really hard for us and the lawyers that we work with to understand when MPP is applied and when it's not during the pandemic. And we've found that primarily it's being applied to Venezuelans and Cubans, because the US does have an agreement that they cannot be deported back to their country. And so we have to kind of process them in some way, and that ends up being through MPP. So that 10,000 chunk has been a lot of Cubans and Venezuelans, at least from what we've seen. And so just to give some MPP statistics, at least what we were seeing in courts before they suspended processing. Oh, I should clarify. When the border was closed and then they continued to process those 10,000 people with MPP, that means processing them just in applying MPP to them. Okay, you have your court date. We're going to send you back to Mexico. Here's your court date. You'll have to show up this day. Those court dates, again, being postponed. And they're all being postponed because the MPP courts have not opened. So just to kind of clarify that detail, people are still receiving MPP or having it applied to them, but they're not going to court to finally have their first court proceeding. So before courts were closed, we were seeing really concerning statistics with MPP asylum cases. So only 4.1% of asylum seekers and migrants in attendance were granted relief. Now, granted, someone that was represented had a 10 times higher chance of receiving some sort of protection, but less than 10% of people that went to MPP court were represented. And that is absolutely what MPP was supposed to do. If someone is waiting in Mexico, in a country where they're unstable and where they can't work and where they can't get access to an attorney in the US, then they'll probably not come represented, and therefore they'll probably lose. And so it was just by cutting off that access to representation, it really affected the chances to be able to successfully walk away from those asylum court proceedings. So looking a little bit more closely at what's happened with COVID, we very much view it as the vehicle for the immigration agenda that Trump always wanted, which was no immigration. And so that's effectively what he's been able to do. As far as legal immigration, he's totally cut off legal immigration. Apprehensions in the desert are still the same; they're actually higher, and we found that it feels inconsistent with what. Well, he is inconsistent, but it feels inconsistent just because he was choking off the legal way and kind of pushing people to cross undocumented. And so looking right now at kind of what's going on, this is showing where there are metering lists. Again, not everyone's doing the same thing. If it's red, that means the list is closed, AKA it's disappeared. And if it's green, that means they're still putting people on the list. And so that's also concerning, and forcing people along the border during a pandemic to try to attempt to travel to these other cities where they can put their name on an incredibly long list, thinking that might be the city where they'll have a chance at later having their name called once borders are opened. But that's a really unsafe thing to be doing. Well, one, in Mexico, if you're traveling as a migrant, and two, to do so during a pandemic and kind of counterproductive to the efforts of mitigating COVID. But again, just kind of a representation here of kind of how it's not a streamlined, organized process. Each port of entry and each person or group or official that manages the list kind of decides as they go what they're going to do with the list. So it's incredibly unstable for those who are putting their name on the list. And so how COVID exacerbated an already bleak situation, we see just with that last map or graphic that, okay, there's even more or even less clarity. We're seeing Title 42 expulsions. Those are express deportations, actually, as we call them and as the migrants call them as well. We talked about when, before Trump, when you would enter or be apprehended in the desert or enter at the port of entry, you would have this right to be asked, are you fleeing any sort of persecution, to put them through a credible fear interview. But because of the Title 42 expulsions, the government has a complete right to not even ask that question. It doesn't matter if they are fleeing harm, if they're attempting to seek asylum, they're apprehended and they're taken immediately back. They don't have to go through any sort of processing, anything formal. They just get dropped off at the border. There's technically a law that they're supposed to not drop people off in the middle of the night. It's supposed to happen from 7 in the morning to 7 at night, and they're doing it in the middle of the night, dropping people off in Nogales, where they don't have a place to eat or sleep. It's a total mafia and cartel controlled area. And so we find a lot of cases of violence happening because of those expulsions that shouldn't be happening in the wee hours of the night anyways. And so that's been a problem that we've seen. I mentioned the postponed MPP hearings, the disappeared metering list, discrepancies with how MPP is applied. We don't know how that number decided to jump from 60,000 to 70,000. We have a guess, but we're not entirely sure why certain people are getting MPP. And so it's really created a lot of uncertainty on top of uncertainty that migrants were already feeling and experiencing. And the result, at least in Nogales, has been to take all of this and to organize protests. And so that's what we've been doing. For the past, since August, we've had 4 different actions. We're having our next one in 2 weeks. I'll talk a little bit about that. But what has happened amongst migrants that are at Kino Border Initiative is that they've been there now for months and months, now some of them more than a year. And that has given them time to make connections, create a community, and start organizing. which it's a pity that that has to happen, but it is one of the positive things that has come out of some of this, seeing the migrants really take this and run with it and organize and really call attention to the fact that people are in Nogales and they want answers, and they want a vehicle for having their demands met. And so that's why everyone was a little nervous during election night that became election week, as okay, who is going to win this, and are we going to have a vehicle for getting some of our demands met and getting our voices heard? And the way that KBI has reacted to their want to organize is to be kind of their link and also their megaphone as well. And so we have created the Save Asylum Coalition. It is a group, a binational coalition between about a dozen organizations in the Tucson area, and then KBI in the Nogales area with migrants. And so we serve as that link for them to be organizing together. And these marches that we have take place on both sides of the border. We have migrants that march through downtown Nogales, Sonora. They march right up to the border wall, and that is where they are received by a group of immigration advocates, the ones who are the representatives and the promoters of these events in the Tucson area, who come down, and together they're both pushing for the same message, but it's always generated by the migrants and projected by those who are on the US side of the border. And we've been really pushing and organizing more and more. It seems like we reach more people with each action, which has been really energizing for migrants, and why they've continued doing this, and why it's been uplifting during a time of such bleakness. And so what these marches are rooted in are actually not civil disobedience. We try to stay away from that term because we are calling attention to the fact that the US is not complying with its own asylum law. And so we are not the ones disobeying anything. Rather, we are simply asking the US to comply with its law to offer refuge and protection for those who are fleeing harm, which is what our asylum law says. It is what we've signed on to in international treaties, and the US has gotten away with not doing that thus far. However, MPP does go to the Supreme Court at the end of this month. It has been ruled by lower courts that it is absolutely illegal, and so the Supreme Court will decide. I will admit that not all of our hope is in the Supreme Court right now, but it is more in the fact that the Biden-Harris administration has said that they plan to get rid of MPP. Immigration was not brought up a lot during the debates and during the campaign, which is a little funny because it was brought up a lot in 2016. But Biden has consistently said in one of the presidential debates and in his plan that he plans to get rid of metering and he plans to get rid of MPP. And so having the outcome of seeing Biden win, we now know, okay, this is now up to us to really pressure him to stay true to his word in this. And so we're going to keep organizing, probably even more so now that we know that Biden is coming in, to keep applying that pressure, because his platform is starkly different, or the complete opposite of what we've seen under the Trump administration. And so we know we don't necessarily see Biden winning as like the victory, but it's the starting point for repairing the harm that we've seen throughout the past 4 years. And so the short-term goal right now, the first and foremost, and the short-term goal that the migrants have for our upcoming action are the following: get rid of rapid expulsions, get rid of MPP, and get rid of metering, because these are the things that totally dismantled asylum. They want to see those gone, and they want to see asylum restored. And so that's why our movement is called Save Asylum. And so if you do want to learn more about it and follow along, you can go to saveasylum.org. This is not the KBI website. It is a coalition, and so no one group has ownership of the of the website. It's just where we kind of all come together on this shared message. And so I would invite you to go there. Our next action is on December 2nd, and that is when migrants again will be marching through downtown Sonora. We live stream all of our events so people can virtually march and protest with us. And then we always have a call to action at the end. And so this specific event that's coming up is addressing or recognizing the Biden victory, and then presenting the letter that migrants themselves in Nogales have written, which lay out and outline all of the demands that they have for the first 100 days in office, or for Biden's first 100 days in office. And that petition following the event will then be public for advocates all over the country to be able, and beyond, to be able to sign on to. So we really ask that you pay attention to this. And if you can't be in Nogales, you can be with us in solidarity. You can be with us virtually, and be lifting up the voices of migrants who are the ones writing these demands, and they're the ones that are really projecting this message. And it's just kind of an honor for KBI to be that megaphone, as mentioned. So I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen, actually, because that was the end point for me. And I'm curious if there's any comments or questions. I kind of just kept going and stopped pausing there. So maybe I missed some things. So you can help me field questions, Ellie.
Yes, so first thing, I just want to elevate one of the questions in the chat dropped in here by Alan Green. How many waiting in Mexico have been afflicted with COVID? Can they receive treatment?
How many? Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. There's not a lot of testing that is happening to be able to have an accurate number. Most of the reporting that we've seen, so we have not, so just speaking for KBI and Nogales, no one has had an outbreak yet that we know of. And they don't have access to healthcare, which is why this is really difficult to be able to track. We absolutely feel like all of those who are in Nogales would be safer in the US with their sponsors, quarantining with, or taking, mitigating measures with their sponsors or their family members there, rather than being in the living situations that they're in Nogales. But I'm sure there have been outbreaks. We just don't know about them as much. An example, though, just a sample, would be like the success story of Matamoros, the migrant camp there, that they kind of manage their own clinic amongst the migrants, and they have really done a good job at mitigating the spread of COVID and have not had outbreaks. And so I think that goes to show that there are some unlikely stories amongst the COVID media coverage, that sometimes there are places that you wouldn't expect that would do a really good job at managing this and taking it very seriously. And the migrants that we work with very much do. And so it's never been difficult for us to get migrants on board with really caring about COVID and caring about protecting each other, and have always complied with the protocols that we've had. Mm-hmm.
And we have just enough time for one more question. So I'll go ahead and read this one that's in the chat here. Do you know why Cubans and Venezuelans are not sent back to their countries?
So historically, the US has always recognized the Cuban regime as a dictator. And so if you look historically at asylum approval rates, there was a time where we were giving 99% of Cubans asylum. And so that's why we have such a large Cuban population in the US. And so that tendency for the US to recognize the Cuban government as a dictatorship, and one that is not in the interest of the US, we're more quickly to have agreements with them that, okay, we won't deport anyone back because it is so dangerous, or it is so bad there. That's been historical for Cuba and recent for Venezuela. So the US has also deemed Venezuela to be an unsafe place to be. And so then they by law can't deport people back to Venezuela. However, for Central America or Northern Triangle countries, Mexico, we don't we have not historically ever really recognized those countries as unsafe. And so with ease, the US will deport people back to those countries. And unfortunately, yeah.
Got it. Well, that is all of the time we have for questions right now. We will come back together at the end of the session to um, share out any closing announcements. I welcome that you save your questions until then. We are going to transition into an activity in just a moment. But before we do that, just want to say thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing that presentation. I feel like I learned a lot. I'm sure other folks on the call did as well.
Thank you so much for the space. And it was great to see all of you and meet all of you. And so I wish you the best in some of these really great activities that that they have planned for you guys. So thanks for the space, and please follow saveasylum.org and check it out.
Awesome. Thank you. So Alex, I'll kick it to you now to go ahead and share those slides to get us ready for the activity.
Cool. Thank you, Ellie. So the activity is going to be a journaling activity. So if you can please get something to write with and something to write on ready. And let me share these slides. Okay. Is everyone seeing them? Cool. So we're going to be thinking about the process to access safety and access rights and resources here in the United States. So to start, I want to share a couple slides. So this slide here features a sample of questions that people are asked as they request asylum. We want to think about what rights do asylum seekers have. Asylum seekers have once they are granted asylum. So they have right to stay in the United States, which means they're escaping conditions which were unsafe in their home country. They have a right to work and access certain government programs. After a year, they can begin a process to become a permanent resident. I also want to share a little bit of background about how this fits into some of the reporting that we've been doing at City Bureau. So over the last few months, we've been writing stories about the ways that immigrant communities build power and participate in democracy. This has included researching participation in voting and the elections, but also on other forms of civic participation, such as the census, protesting, mutual aid. So I'm going to share another slide, which includes some questions that people are asked as they seek citizenship in the United States. So we know with citizenship comes access to voting, running for office, greater access to government benefits, overall greater protection, and a message of belonging and greater power in the US to shape decision-making. So in this activity, we're going to split you off into breakout rooms with members of our elections team. And this team in the last few weeks has been reporting on the elections with the centering of immigrant communities. So that has meant uplifting issues like language access at the polls, looking into how immigrant voters are participating in the elections, and asking immigrants without access to voting their views on important elections issues and how they will be affected. So these are the election team members who will be leading an activity, and so I hope that we can reflect on some of these questions and look at some of the prompts that they will have to reflect on what it means to seek safety and access, and it'll be kind of a personal reflective activity. And then there will be an opportunity to share with each other and share out some of your thoughts.
Thank you,
So
Alex. Yes, sorry. I feel like I just cut everybody off on Zoom all the time because of the weird timing. Apologies. Just to reiterate what Alex shared, you'll go into a breakout group. You'll have one facilitator per room. Your facilitators will just read some prompts out loud to you. We welcome you to respond in journaling, and then at the end we'll have a little time for discussion. So I'm going to send everyone into a breakout group now, and we'll come back at about 5:25. Now, welcome back. I'd love to, just to close out the evening, and before we move into any last announcements, I'd love to take a time now to take a couple comments. If you feel that anything struck you from those breakout groups, or just want to share what you talked about or journaled about, feel free to share that now. And if you have any remaining questions for Sarah, feel free to ask those. We'll just take a couple comments and then move on to announcements. But yeah, anyone want to share anything or ask a question before we part ways?
I really liked one comment in our breakout around, I forgot who said, oh, Kimberly, I think I really enjoyed the comment you had around thinking more holistically about what's caused the migration of people to the United States beyond, yeah, like kind of beyond like this kind of case of people trying to move here to seek a better life. There's a lot of history to that. So I appreciated that comment. I think it's important to keep in mind that context.
Oh, yeah, about, kind of the U.S. intervention in other, in politics in other countries, and then it kind of disables their whole society, and then they're kind of forced to be migrants. Yeah, we touched on that. So, I don't know. I don't know where else to go with that. It'd be neat to have a speaker on that as well, I think, for US-backed regime change. Yeah. So
I think that is an important comment to sort of like expand our context when we're thinking about immigration. Anyone else have any questions or want to share anything that struck them from the breakout group? I see a little question in the chat for you, Sarah. What's the best way to reach you with questions post-workshop?
I can actually just put my email right now in the chat, and then everyone can save it if you choose.
that's neat.
Cool, thank you. Great. So for the sake of time, I think we will move on to just closing out now. Just want to take a minute to thank everyone who joined us today. I really appreciate you all spending your Thursday afternoon with us. And also just like to give an extra special big thanks to Sarah, our presenter, to Alex for co-organizing this event with me, to our reporting fellows, Linda, Paco, and Lily, who helped with moderating, and also to Jennifer from CPL for having us on this slate of programming. Before I close out the newsroom, I'm wondering, Sarah, Alex, or Jennifer, is there anything you'd like to share or promote before we close out?
Well, I just want to say thanks so much to City Bureau. You've been great partners for a couple of years now, and we've been able to continue it virtually. And I appreciate you guys making this particular edition of the newsroom part of our theme for this year. So we always love to partner with you guys. If anybody's interested in One Book, One Chicago programs, onebookonechicago.org has all of the details for all of our upcoming programs. We have many programs archived on our YouTube channel if you want to catch up on some of that. And on December 3rd, we'll be hosting Mohsin Hamid for our season finale at 7 p.m. on the CPL YouTube and Facebook channel. So onebookonechicago.org has all the details.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. I would encourage you to paste that into the takeaways if you haven't already, so folks have that on hand. Anything else from Alex or Sarah?
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about the lessons today. I'm going to promote this link that has work from the elections team, so you can kind of see the work that we've been doing over the last few weeks. And we're going to still have a few more stories come out, and it will all be updated there. So thanks so much, and I'm really happy to be part of this event.
Awesome. Well, thanks again to everyone. I just want to point you guys towards some next steps and resources if you're curious about learning more about the topic that we covered tonight. If you open up the public agenda, if you have it open already, scroll all the way down to the bottom. There is a takeaway section which has further readings and some of the opportunities and resources that we just shared. And if you are curious about connecting with other attendees after the workshop, I encourage you to, just above that section, there's a stay in touch header. If you want to drop your name and contact info there, if you'd like to connect with other folks interested in this topic, feel free to do that. And yes, like Sarah just pasted in the chat, don't forget to check out saveasylum.org and attend virtually their December 2nd event. And a plug of our own on City Bureau's behalf, we are actually turning 5 this year, which is really exciting. We are celebrating all of the work that we have done with our network, our community over those years on December 10th. The party is called Soapbox 2020. Those of you who have been to our fundraisers in the past know that naming convention. And the event is structured like a public newsroom. So if you liked tonight, there's a good chance that you'll like this upcoming event, which is donate what you can. So even if you just want to chip in $1, we'd love to see you there. The important thing for us is really to have as many people who participate in our programming there so that we can use your insights to shape the next year of our work. So yeah, feel free to check that out. The registration is in the survey, or rather the registration link is in the public agenda. My only other ask for you tonight is to fill out just like a 3-minute survey for this event, which is also linked in the document we've been consulting. And I think that is finally it for me. Thank you guys for staying over about 4 minutes. Once again, really appreciate your participation. If you want to stick around and chat a little bit longer, I'll be on the Zoom, but otherwise, have a great rest of your Thursday evening.